Joni Mitchell was born Roberta Joan Anderson on November 7, 1943, in Fort Macleod, Canada. Her father was an Air Force lieutenant, and her mother taught elementary school. Because of that, Joni's early years were marked by strict discipline, something that planted in her both a rebellious streak and a deep love for freedom. It showed early. By the age of 9, she was already sneaking her father's tobacco and riding her bike out into the fields, escaping her parents' watchful eyes to be alone with nature and the smell of cigarette smoke. Her mother, on the other hand, nurtured her daughter's love for art and self-education, something that would later prove invaluable. In 1951, Joni contracted polio during a regional outbreak. Confined to a hospital bed, she entertained the other patients by retelling stories from books she had read, and when those ran out, she began making up her own. Eventually, those stories turned into songs. It was there, in that hospital room, that Joni first realized creativity could be a form of healing. When the illness finally subsided, Joni thought life would get easier, but in reality, her fight simply changed shape. First, she had to defend her right to play the guitar against her mother's disapproval. Her mother feared it would lead her into bad company. When Joni eventually taught herself to play using Pete Seeger's songbook, she had to fight something even tougher: her own body. Polio had weakened her left hand, forcing her to invent alternate tunings to compensate, a challenge that would later become her creative signature. Still, it's hard to say that Joni dreamed of becoming a singer back then. Even though her teachers noticed her poetic talent as early as 7th grade, she was far more drawn to painting, and music was mostly a way to make friends. And, as her mother had feared, her guitar eventually led her into a rowdy crowd of friends. She even dropped out of school for a while and came close to real trouble, but Joni managed to pull herself back, returned to her studies, and decided to channel her ambitions into art. After finishing high school at Aidan Bowman Collegiate in Saskatoon, she took art classes at the Saskatoon Technical Collegiate under abstract painter Henry Bonley, then left home to attend the Alberta College of Art in Calgary in 1963. However, she quickly grew disillusioned. The college prioritized technical skill over free creativity, and Joni felt out of place among the cold abstraction and the push toward commercial art. Once again, she found herself torn, struggling between her desire to pour her emotions onto canvas and her growing sense that holding a guitar felt far more natural than holding a paintbrush. It's impossible to say how her life might have turned out if it hadn't been for love. At art college, Joni met a young painter named Brad McMath. Both were poor, creative, and stubborn. Their relationship was passionate, but it had no real future. When Joni became pregnant in late 1963, her world was turned upside down. In conservative 1960s Canada, an unmarried student with a child was practically an outcast. Her parents reacted coldly, and whispers began to spread around the college. For Joni, it was the last straw. In the spring of 1964, she dropped out. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. She understood that art would remain in her life, but now it had to feed her. So she picked up her guitar and started singing in Calgary coffee houses. Among the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke, she felt for the first time that the stage was her true home. But life grew harder. Money ran out, Brad drifted away, and her pregnancy neared its end. In January 1965, Joni gave birth to a baby girl, Kelly Dale Anderson. It was a moment of both love and despair. No husband, no apartment, no income. After long, sleepless nights, she made a heartbreaking decision to give her baby up for adoption. Years later, journalists would claim that Joni's desire to fulfill her creative potential outweighed her maternal instinct, that it was a calculated move rather than a desperate one. But her songs tell a different story. Again and again, she would return to that wound, showing how deeply the loss shaped her. It didn't break her, it gave her depth. Yet the pain was so strong that even staying in Calgary became unbearable. She packed her things and headed to Toronto, starting over from nothing. Joni slept on friends' couches, played in cheap coffee houses, sometimes literally for food. But in those dimly lit rooms, Joni Mitchell was born. She stopped singing other people's songs and began writing her own, simple yet painfully honest, with melodies that carried traces of jazz and the cold wind of the Canadian prairies. It didn't take long for her talent to be noticed. In the spring of 1965, she met Chuck Mitchell, an experienced folk musician who was impressed by her authenticity and saw in her a chance to revive his own career. He invited her to perform as a duo, but the musical partnership quickly turned romantic. By the fall, they were married, and Joan Anderson became Joni Mitchell. Their duo, Chuck and Joni Mitchell, gained modest success on the Canadian folk circuit. It wasn't fame, but it was a step up for both of them. Still, what looked harmonious on stage soon fell apart off it. Chuck treated Joni as a partner, but not as an equal. He wanted to guide her, to shape her, to teach her. She, intuitive and fiercely independent by nature, couldn't stand being molded. Music, the very thing that had united them, became a battlefield. He demanded discipline. She searched for truth. It ended as quickly and intensely as it began. In 1967, Joni took her guitar, a notebook full of songs, and left for New York City to begin the life that would finally make her a legend. She had to start over from scratch, but Joni Mitchell wasn't afraid. By then, she already had her own repertoire, her own image, and valuable stage experience, something that set her apart from the hundreds of young musicians flooding New York City in the late 60s. Joni settled into a cheap rented room and began performing at the Gaslight Cafe and the Bitter End, the very places where street poets were turning into legends. She studied the competition carefully and made a deliberate choice not to follow the trend of political protest songs. Her lyrics sounded as if she were peering into the human soul under a microscope. They weren't about protest or romanticized poverty. They were about truth. Her songs were living stories. Urge for Going captured the inevitability of change. The Circle Game explored growing up in the passage of time, and Both Sides Now reflected on the duality of emotions and experience. These songs resonated deeply, and it wasn't long before Judy Collins recorded Both Sides Now and turned it into a national hit. That moment brought Joni recognition and connections that would change her life. In 1968, she met David Crosby of the Byrds. He was among the first to see in her not just a songwriter, but a true artist. Crosby convinced her to move to Los Angeles and record her first album. That move led her to Laurel Canyon, a community of musicians, artists, and poets living among the trees, creating the music that would define a generation. Her debut album, Song to a Seagull, 1968, sounded like a morning prayer. Her voice floated above her guitar like a seagull over the ocean, free, fragile, and haunting. There was no ambition in it, just an honest desire to be heard. The lyrics spoke of freedom, solitude, and the search for identity. It wasn't commercial folk, it was an intimate diary set to music. Critics praised her unusual harmonies and open tunings, but most of all they praised her voice, as if it came from within the human spirit rather than from outside it. Her debut was a success, and Joni quickly became a notable figure on the California scene. More and more artists began covering her songs. In 1969, she released her second album, Clouds. Her songwriting grew sharper, her poetry more focused. She even painted the cover herself, showing that for her, music, painting, and words were one and the same. The album earned her first Grammy Award, featuring songs like Chelsea Morning, I Don't Know Where I Stand, and a new, more reflective version of Both Sides Now. If her debut had been a diary of self-discovery, Clouds marked her arrival as a mature artist. At the time, Joni was living in Laurel Canyon with Graham Nash of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Their relationship radiated warmth and harmony. They wrote songs about each other and treated love as an ongoing creative experiment. Yet, beneath the calm, Joni felt a growing restlessness. She began to realize that even love, as deep and genuine as it was, could become a cage. Nash dreamed of a home, children, stability. Joni dreamed of movement, sound, and the freedom to find herself through art. By now, she had transformed from a folk singer into a genre-breaking songwriter. In 1970, she released Ladies of the Canyon, an album that captured her at her most confident, an artist fully aware of her power and voice. It wasn't just a collection of songs, it was a portrait of her world, her friends, her neighbors, her loves, her losses. Big Yellow Taxi carried an ecological warning beneath its upbeat rhythm. Woodstock became an anthem for a generation that believed music could heal the world, and the Circle Game embodied her philosophy of time and change. Every song was an observation, not a sermon. She didn't accuse or preach. She simply saw, understood, and described. The album was both a critical and commercial triumph, and with that came the unexpected weight of fame. Joni had achieved everything she once dreamed of. Now she was the one setting the rules, but ironically, success left her feeling tired and confined, the very thing she had always feared. The stage kept demanding more from her, yet Joni found herself increasingly aware that the audience was hearing her songs without truly listening. She was surrounded by admiration and by pressure. At some point, she decided to disappear. She stopped touring, shut the doors of her Laurel Canyon home, and simply left. No plan, no entourage, just her guitar and a notebook. That journey became her personal reset. She drifted through Europe, Greece, France, Crete, Spain, places where she could be anonymous, a stranger among tourists and sunlight. There, between the sea and whitewashed walls, she began to write again. The songs came out of solitude, out of memory, out of an urgent need to understand who she was, without fame, without love, without an audience. This period became the foundation of her masterpiece, Blue, 1971. The album wasn't just confessional, and it shattered the idea of a song as mere entertainment. Each track felt alive, pulsing with raw emotion stripped of masks or pretense. Blue had no filler, no wasted words. In River, she mourned a lost love. In A Case of You, she measured passion like fine wine. In California, she longed for a home she never really had. Even the title itself was a metaphor. Blue wasn't just sadness, it was a whole spectrum of feeling, from tenderness to despair. Musically, it was a revelation. Sparse arrangements, intricate harmonies, unconventional tunings, and phrasing that blurred the line between folk and jazz. It was the moment Joni Mitchell stopped being a woman with a guitar and became an artist who painted with sound. After Blue, she could have easily rested on her laurels. The album was hailed as an instant classic. But Joni never liked repeating herself. So in 1972, she released For the Roses, colder, more distant, and more analytical. Having experienced another wave of success, and the fatigue that came with it, she began examining the very nature of fame, how it distorts love, makes solitude impossible, and turns a person into a product. In songs like You Turn Me On, I'm a Radio and Brand Grill, she viewed herself almost from the outside, not as the heroine of a story, but as a character trapped in the media's reflection. These reflections on fame, art, and self-awareness led Joni to a turning point. Recognition no longer mattered. What drove her now was creation itself, experiment, expression, emotion. She was done chasing approval. She wanted to explore. In 1974, she released Court and Spark, the album that marked her full escape from folk. Joni began working with jazz musicians, experimenting with rhythm, texture, and sonic layering. The result was a perfect balance between sophistication and accessibility, intelligent yet inviting. Help Me became a hit, her most successful single, but beneath its gentle melody lay quiet irony, a love song from someone who already knew how it would end. In Free Man in Paris and People's Parties, she wrote about Los Angeles and the music industry not as an insider, but as a witness. The more fame she gained, the more she seemed to step away from it. By then, her art and her life had become inseparable. Joni began writing about things that couldn't be said outright, using symbols, metaphors, and inner landscapes instead of confession. On stage, she appeared fragile, almost ethereal, yet her songs revealed a steel-like independence. With each passing year, her music grew more complex, more demanding, and less willing to fit neatly into the boundaries of radio or genre. By 1975, Joni Mitchell had completely broken away from her folk roots. Her album The Hissing of Summer Lawns became her most ambitious project yet. For the first time, it featured African rhythms, electric bass, and experimental textures, elements that would later be recognized as a daring step toward art jazz. The record was met with confusion. Critics expected another Blue or at least a restrained, elegant Court and Spark, but instead they got a mosaic of sounds, metaphors, and urban imagery. Joni, however, saw it as a natural evolution. If Blue was a cry from within, The Hissing of Summer Lawns was a look from the outside, at society, at women in gilded cages, at the America where glamour hides exhaustion. By that point, it seemed as if Joni no longer cared about pleasing critics or audiences. She was turning her confessions into art, and she relished that freedom. Yet, happiness never seemed to be her source of inspiration. What truly fueled her, ever since childhood, was struggle. The constant need to challenge herself, to wrestle with something unseen, became the inexhaustible engine of her creativity. So she left her home, abandoned fleeting romances, and took to the road to write what would become her next masterpiece, Hejira, 1976. It turned out to be one of the most cohesive and philosophical albums of her career. Though it contained no obvious hits, it was an inward symphony about travel, solitude, freedom, and the impossibility of ever fully belonging to someone or something. The music unfolded like a landscape, steady, endless, like a highway beneath rolling tires. This was also the first time she collaborated with Jaco Pastorius of Weather Report, whose fretless bass became not just her musical partner, but her spiritual counterpart. His fluid playing wrapped around her voice in songs like Coyote, Amelia, and Hejira, creating a dreamlike sense of motion where time seemed to dissolve. It was a quiet, inevitable revelation. After that, she dove fully into jazz. In 1977, she released Don Juan's Reckless Daughter, a sprawling double-album experiment that was chaotic, spiritual, and wildly ambitious. Joni no longer sang about personal stories. She painted musical canvases where lyrics became rhythm and rhythm became philosophy. She used African percussion, choirs, and improvisation, blending acoustic and electronic instruments in ways that were years ahead of their time. The album polarized listeners. Some called it genius, others thought she had lost her melody. But Joni saw it as progress, a move beyond the boundaries that trap most artists. She wasn't trying to be liked. She was trying to express what words alone could never capture. It was around this time that Charles Mingus, the legendary jazz composer, entered her life. He was gravely ill but determined to create something new before he died. He invited Joni to collaborate, seeing in her not just a singer but an equal, a true artist. Together they began shaping a project that would merge his music with her words. Mingus composed the harmonies. Joni wrote the lyrics. Their relationship was intense, a clash of genius and will. He admired her but constantly tested her, challenged her, provoked her. For perhaps the first time in her life, Joni, the fiercely independent artist, found someone who could teach her, and she accepted it. Mingus became her mentor, her mirror, her final great lesson. When he died in 1979, Joni finished the project and released it as Mingus. It wasn't just a tribute, it was her declaration that she no longer belonged to any genre. The record had no conventional verses or choruses. It was a dialogue between her voice and the instruments, between poetry and jazz. In songs like Goodbye Pork Pie Hat and The Dry Cleaner from Des Moines, you could hear light, loss, and gratitude all at once. As usual, the public wasn't ready. Critics called it distant, abstract, too far removed from her roots. And though Joni had long claimed indifference to criticism, this time it hurt. Perhaps it was grief, perhaps fatigue, but for the first time in years she withdrew inward, reflecting quietly on what music meant to her and what was left to say. Joni Mitchell returned in 1982 with Wild Things Run Fast, a surprising turn after her long dive into jazz. Gone were the sprawling improvisations. This time she embraced rhythm, clarity, even a touch of pop rock. But this shift wasn't about rethinking her artistic direction. It was about love. Joni had fallen for Larry Klein, a talented young bassist and producer. He was younger, but quickly became more than a partner. He was her collaborator, her muse, and, for a time, her anchor. Their relationship brought her a kind of stability she'd never known before, and with it, a new burst of creative energy. Wild Things Run Fast sounded brighter, bolder, alive with the confidence of a woman who had finally allowed herself to feel joy again. Songs like Chinese Cafe / Unchained Melody blended nostalgic reflections on youth with meditations on aging, while You Dream Flat Tires and Solid Love were playful and light, something rare for Mitchell. Critics were divided, but listeners could sense the change. She had rediscovered the pleasure of rhythm and simplicity without losing her lyrical depth. The following years were filled with touring and travel alongside Klein. Together they became a kind of creative laboratory. He brought grooves and bass lines. She built worlds around them. Their next project, Dog Eat Dog, 1985, marked a bold step into the electronic sound of the decade, and perhaps more strikingly, into politics. This wasn't a personal confession anymore, but a social commentary on a world increasingly dominated by technology, television, and power. She criticized religious fanaticism, corporate greed, and the numbing effect of mass media. The album was sharp, at times even abrasive, uncomfortable listening for fans who longed for her poetic intimacy. Still, it revealed something essential about Joni, her need to document her time, even when it meant alienating her audience. Artistically, it was a risk. She knew most fans wanted love songs, not reflections on Reagan's America, but she'd never been one to give people what they expected. Joni didn't just want to make art, she wanted it to matter. In Smokin', Empty, Try Another, she used a collage of urban sounds. In Good Friends, a gospel pop duet with Michael McDonald, she sang about friendship as one of the last honest refugees in a cynical world. By the end of the decade, her sound grew calmer, more reflective, and spiritually grounded. Joni could never turn her songs into blunt political weapons. Her gift was always confession, not confrontation. That balance defined her next album, Chalkmark in a Rainstorm, 1988, where she fused social awareness with her signature introspection. There was less anger and more contemplation. She invited friends, Peter Gabriel, Don Henley, Willie Nelson, and sang about memory, war, and the illusions of modern culture. The Tea Leaf Prophecy looked back at her parents' wartime experiences. grounding her music in personal history while cool water felt like a prayer whispered into the desert wind. By the dawn of the 1990s, Joni Mitchell had become a living legend, respected, timeless, and still searching. But the calm of the 1980s shattered in 1991 when she and Larry Klein separated. The breakup was more than personal. It shook her creative foundation. Klein had been her collaborator, her partner in innovation, her emotional support. Losing him meant losing the person who'd helped her translate her inner world into sound. For Joni, who had built her entire career on transformation, this loss marked the start of another, quieter reinvention. In 1991, Joni Mitchell released Night Ride Home, a quiet, contemplative return to her acoustic roots after a decade of electronic experimentation. The album breathed with night air and wisdom, filled with the calm of someone who had stopped running and started reflecting. In Come In From the Cold, she mused on aging and the fragile warmth we try to preserve in an increasingly cold world. Cherokee Louise told the story of a childhood friend who survived abuse, a rare moment where Joni addressed social issues through an intimate, personal lens. Night Ride Home wasn't about storms. It was about serenity. The voice of a woman who had finally made peace with the idea that life isn't a constant journey forward, but a series of reflections. Then came an event that would transform her life. Back in the 1960s, she had given up her newborn daughter for adoption, a decision that haunted her for decades and inspired songs like Little Green. In the mid-1990s, driven perhaps by solitude or by age's quiet wisdom, Joni decided to find her daughter. In 1997, she finally did. The reunion with Lauren Gibb was deeply emotional, a mixture of joy, pain, and confusion. Joni later said it felt like closing a wound that had never stopped bleeding. That long-awaited connection reshaped her emotionally and artistically, giving her a new sense of wholeness she had never known. Just a few years earlier, in 1994, she had released Turbulent Indigo, one of the most powerful albums of her later career. The cover depicted Van Gogh's self-portrait, but with Joni's own face replacing the painter's, a symbolic declaration that she too was an artist living between beauty and pain. The album dealt with loneliness, moral decay, and the desensitized modern world. In Sex Kills and the Magdalene Laundries, she explored themes of hypocrisy, female suffering, and spiritual disillusionment. Musically, Turbulent Indigo fused her signature jazz-inflected harmonies with a restrained, chamber-like intimacy. Critics hailed it as one of the decade's finest comebacks, and it earned her a Grammy for Best Pop Album. But beyond accolades, Turbulent Indigo revealed a new maturity. Joni was no longer confessing. She was observing, writing as a philosopher and witness. By the late 90s, she began reflecting on her own legacy. Taming the Tiger, 1998, felt like a meditative farewell, a soft, atmospheric album where she experimented with a guitar-synth hybrid that created transparent, fluid textures. The music was delicate, almost watercolor-like, filled with reflections on time, fame, and the fading of illusions. In Harlem and Havana, she looked back on youth. In Man from Mars, she said goodbye to a lover. In Stay in Touch, she made peace with her past. Then, in 2000, she released Both Sides Now, the emotional culmination of her career. More than an album, it was a musical autobiography. Joni reimagined classic jazz standards like At Last and You've Changed, alongside orchestral reinterpretations of her own A Case of You and Both Sides Now. The difference was striking. Songs once sung by a young woman full of wonder were now delivered by an older one who understood what those words truly meant. Where there had once been longing and confusion, now there was acceptance and grace. 2 years later, she completed the circle with Travelogue, 2002. A double album where she revisited her own catalog with orchestral arrangements. But rather than nostalgia, it felt like a painter returning to her old canvases, adding new colors, new light. It wasn't a comeback, it was closure. By then, Joni Mitchell had transcended not just genres, but time itself. She had lived through every version of herself, of the dreamer, the rebel, the poet, the philosopher. And Travelogue stood as her final statement, that art like life is never finished, only transformed. After Travelogue, Joni announced that she was leaving the music industry. She had grown tired of the commercial side of show business, the contracts, the formulas, the advertising. She often said that the world of art had become a hostage to marketing, and that real music was dying under the weight of polish and promotion. She returned to California, gave almost no interviews, and threw herself completely into painting. Her work, self-portraits, abstractions, images of people she loved, began appearing in galleries. Critics noted that her paintings carried the same touch as her songs, light yet mercilessly precise. During these years, Joni led a quiet, almost reclusive life, appearing in public only on rare occasions. Then, in 2007, she unexpectedly came back with a new album, Shine. It wasn't an attempt to revive old fame, but more of a gentle statement. I still feel the record was steeped in ecological and philosophical themes. In songs like If I Had a Heart and Strong and Wrong, she reflected on humanity's decline, the exhaustion of nature, and the responsibility we all share for the world we're losing. The music was soft, slow, almost meditative. Her voice had grown lower, warmer, like silk, and it sounded less like a song and more like an inner monologue. Through the 2010s, Joni lived increasingly like a hermit artist. She painted, worked on restoring her old recordings, and spent time with her daughter and granddaughter. Those relationships became her new center of gravity. She often said she finally felt whole, as if she'd found the missing piece of her life that she'd been searching for all along. But fate tested her once again. In 2015, Joni suffered a brain aneurysm rupture. She was found unconscious in her home and for a long time couldn't speak or move. Many believed she would never recover, but she survived, slowly, stubbornly, like someone who had already once relearned how to live after illness, as she had with polio in childhood. Rehabilitation took years. Music became her medicine again, first as sound, then as the movement of her fingers, then as breath itself. Joni said she had to relearn how to breathe in rhythm, as if her body and soul were remembering an old score. And little by little, she returned. In 2022, after nearly 20 years of silence, she unexpectedly appeared on stage at the Newport Folk Festival. It was more than just a musical moment. It was a profoundly human one. The audience stood and wept as she sang, sitting in a chair, smiling as if to say to the world, "I'm still here." Her voice was deeper, slower, but it carried not loss, dignity. In 2023, she received the Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, America's highest honor for musical achievement. At the ceremony, she sang again, not for applause, but for the simple truth that art lives longer than the body. That's who Joni Mitchell was, and still is. A woman who turned confession into art, who fought and rose again every time, and who continues to look at the world through her own extraordinary eyes.